Sarah Miller pulled her dusty Volvo into the driveway of the old Victorian house, a sigh escaping her lips. The house, with its gabled roof, wraparound porch and peeling paint, loomed against the late afternoon sky, a silhouette of faded grandeur. It had been her grandmother's, and now, after her passing, it was Sarah's. Returning to her small Massachusetts hometown felt like stepping back in time, a time she hadn't exactly cherished. Her childhood here had been punctuated by a sense of unease, a feeling of being watched, a feeling she'd hoped to leave behind. The house creaked and groaned as she pushed open the heavy front door, the scent of dust and old wood filling her nostrils. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic patterns on the worn wooden floor. Sarah wandered through the rooms, each one filled with antique furniture shrouded in white sheets. A wave of melancholy washed over her. This house held so many memories, both good and bad. As she explored, a particular room drew her attention: the attic. The narrow, winding staircase leading up was shrouded in shadow. With a hesitant breath, Sarah ascended, the steps groaning. Under her weight, the attic was a cavernous space, filled with forgotten relics of generations past. Moonlight filtered through the grimy windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. In the far corner, partially covered by a tattered sheet, stood a large, ornate mirror. Its frame was intricately carved with swirling patterns, and the glass itself seemed to possess a strange depth. Intrigued, Sarah approached the mirror and pulled away the sheet. The glass was clouded with dust, but as she wiped it clean, her reflection emerged. For a moment she simply stared at her own image, a young woman with tired eyes and a cascade of brown hair. But then, a flicker at the edge of the reflection caught her eye. A dark shape, almost like a shadow, seemed to move just behind her, in the mirror's depths. When she turned quickly, nothing was there. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She told herself it was just a trick of the light, a product of her overactive imagination. But a chill ran down her spine, a primal fear that whispered of something unseen, something else. She stared back at the mirror, half expecting to see the shadow again. But only her own reflection stared back, her eyes wide with a growing unease. The attic air felt heavy, charged with a presence she couldn't explain. She shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter around her. A distinct feeling of being watched settled upon her, a feeling she couldn't shake as she descended the attic stairs, leaving the mirror and its secrets behind. Or so she thought. The following days were a blur of unpacking, cleaning, and trying to settle into the old house. But the unsettling feeling from the attic lingered. Sarah found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Sleep offered little respite. Her dreams were filled with distorted reflections and whispers that seemed to emanate from the mirror. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of her grandmother's belongings, Sarah stumbled upon a collection of old photographs. They depicted the house in its prime, filled with elegantly dressed people. One photo in particular caught her attention. It showed a family posing in front of the very same mirror in the attic. A stern-looking man, a woman with a melancholic expression, and two young children, a boy and a girl. There was something about the girl's eyes, a deep sadness that resonated with Sarah. Driven by a growing curiosity, Sarah decided to visit the local library. She spent hours poring over old town records and newspaper archives, searching for any information about the house and its former occupants. She discovered that the family in the photograph was the Cartwrights, who had lived in the house in the late 19th century. A series of tragic events had befallen them. The young boy had died in a farming accident, and shortly after, the mother had succumbed to a mysterious illness. The father, consumed by grief, had reportedly become a recluse, rarely leaving the house. As Sarah read about the Cartwrights' misfortunes, a chill ran down her spine. The house's oppressive atmosphere suddenly made sense. It felt as if the weight of their sorrow still lingered within its walls. Back at the house, the strange occurrences intensified. Doors would creak open in the middle of the night, and Sarah would hear faint whispers echoing through the empty hallways. One evening, while working late in the living room, she heard a distinct child's giggle coming from upstairs. Her heart pounded in her chest. She cautiously made her way up the stairs, her hand gripping the banister tightly. The giggling stopped as she reached the landing. The house was silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. She tried to rationalize the events, attributing them to drafts, old pipes, and her own heightened anxiety. But deep down, she knew there was something more to it. The house was not just old, it was haunted. And the source of the haunting, she suspected, was connected to the mirror in the attic and the tragic history of the Cartwright family. The mirror in the attic became an obsession for Sarah. She found herself drawn to it. Despite the fear it instilled in her, the visions she saw in its depths grew more vivid, more personal. They no longer seemed like random glimpses of the past, but reflections of her own deepest fears and traumas. One night, as she stood before the mirror, she saw a distorted image of herself as a child, huddled in a corner, her face streaked with tears. The vision triggered a buried memory. The night her parents had left on a business trip and never returned, their plane crashing in a storm. The grief and abandonment she had felt as a child resurfaced, raw and painful. The visions weren't always direct replays of her past. Sometimes they were symbolic, manifesting her anxieties in terrifying ways. She saw herself trapped in a dark, suffocating space, or falling endlessly into an abyss. Each vision left her shaken, her heart pounding, her breath ragged. She began to understand that the mirror wasn't just reflecting the past. It was feeding on her own emotional vulnerabilities, amplifying her fears. Driven by a desperate need to understand the mirror's power, Sarah returned to the library. She searched for any mention of unusual mirrors, folklore, or local legends. She stumbled upon an old book on local history that mentioned a legend about a mirror crafted by a reclusive artisan in the 19th century. It was said that the artisan had imbued the mirror with a dark magic, allowing it to reflect not only physical appearances, but also the inner turmoil of those who gazed into it. The book mentioned that the mirror had been sold to a wealthy family. In the area, the Cartwrights, a shiver ran down Sarah's spine. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The mirror, the Cartwrights, the tragic events that had befallen them, they were all connected. Back at the house, Sarah found an old leather-bound diary hidden inside a drawer in the attic. It belonged to Eleanor Cartwright, the mother in the photograph. As Sarah carefully turned the fragile pages, she began to read Eleanor's story. The diary entries revealed a woman consumed by grief after the loss of her son, her mental state deteriorating rapidly. She wrote about feeling a dark presence in the house, a presence that seemed to emanate from the mirror. In one chilling entry, Eleanor described seeing her son's reflection in the mirror, not as he was in life, but as a decaying corpse. Sarah felt a deep sense of empathy for Eleanor. She understood the pain of loss, the feeling of being haunted by the past. As she read on, she realized that Eleanor's grief had somehow become intertwined with the mirror, creating the malevolent force that now plagued the house. The diary became Sarah's constant companion. Through Eleanor's words, she pieced together the tragic events that had unfolded within the house's walls. Eleanor's entries grew increasingly frantic, detailing terrifying visions in the mirror, visions that mirrored her own growing despair. She wrote of a dark figure lurking just beyond her reflection, a figure that seemed to feed on her grief. One particularly chilling entry described a scene where Eleanor saw her deceased son beckoning her from within the mirror's depths, his eyes hollow and his skin pale. As Sarah delved deeper into Eleanor's story, the activity in the house intensified. The whispers became clearer, forming distinct words, often calling out Eleanor's name. The temperature in the attic plummeted, and Sarah could feel a constant chill in the air, as if an icy presence was always nearby. The visions in the mirror became more vivid and interactive, no longer just static images, but scenes playing out before her eyes. One night, while staring into the mirror, Sarah witnessed a scene from the past. Eleanor, standing before the mirror, her face contorted in grief, clutching a small wooden toy. Suddenly, the reflection of her son appeared beside her, his hand reaching out to touch her. But as Eleanor reached back, the boy's reflection transformed into a grotesque, decaying figure, causing her to recoil in horror. Sarah realized that the mirror was not just a passive observer of the past. It was a conduit, a portal, through which the past could bleed into the present. She understood that the dark figure Eleanor had described was the manifestation of her unresolved grief, a trapped spirit bound to the mirror. She also discovered, through a faded newspaper clipping tucked within the diary, that the young boy, Thomas, had not died in a farming accident, as the town records suggested. He had fallen down the attic stairs, a tragic accident witnessed by his mother, an event that had shattered her. The guilt and trauma of witnessing her son's death had become the core of the haunting. The figure in the mirror was not malevolent in the traditional sense. It was a manifestation of Eleanor's pain, a desperate attempt to reconnect with her lost child. But the mirror, imbued with its dark magic, twisted this desire into something terrifying, feeding on the fears and traumas of anyone who dared to look into its depths. Sarah now understood the full extent of the tragedy and the mirror's role. In it, the stage was set for a final confrontation. The night of the full moon cast long, eerie shadows across the house, amplifying the already unsettling atmosphere. Sarah knew the time for a final confrontation had arrived. Armed with Eleanor's diary and a newfound understanding of the haunting, she made her way to the attic. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, the temperature frigid. The mirror, bathed in moonlight, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light. As Sarah stood before it, the whispers intensified, coalescing into a mournful cry. The reflection in the mirror shimmered, and the image of Eleanor Cartwright appeared, her face etched with sorrow. Behind her, the dark figure loomed, its form indistinct, but undeniably menacing. Then the scene shifted. Sarah saw the moment of Thomas's fall replaying in vivid detail. The small boy tumbling down the attic stairs, Eleanor's scream echoing through the house. The vision was so real, so visceral, that Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Suddenly, the dark figure lunged forward, its shadowy hand reaching out from the mirror's surface. Sarah felt a cold gust of air as the hand brushed against her cheek. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and the dark figure began to emerge, its form solidifying into the shape of a child, but with hollow eyes and a spectral pallor. It was Thomas, twisted and distorted by his mother's grief and the mirror's dark magic. Sarah felt a surge of fear, but also a deep sense of pity. She understood that this was not a malevolent entity, but a trapped soul yearning for release. Remembering Eleanor's diary, Sarah spoke to the reflection, her voice trembling but firm. "Eleanor," she said, "I know what happened. I know about Thomas. It wasn't your fault." As she spoke, the image of Eleanor in the mirror turned towards her, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and confusion. The spectral Thomas also turned, his hollow gaze fixing on Sarah. "He's gone," the figure whispered, its voice a raspy echo. "He is," Sarah replied. "But you can be with him. You don't have to stay here, trapped in this mirror. She looked directly at the spectral child. "Thomas, your mother loves you. She never blamed you." A change flickered across the spectral Thomas's face. The menacing expression softened, replaced by a look of confusion, then sadness. The dark figure began to dissipate, its form becoming less defined. The mirror's surface calmed, the rippling effect subsiding. As the spectral Thomas faded, the image of Eleanor in the mirror began to soften as well. A look of peace washed over her face, replacing the years of grief and torment. She offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile to Sarah, a silent acknowledgement of gratitude. Then she too began to fade, dissolving into the mirror's depths, until only Sarah's own reflection remained. The oppressive atmosphere in the attic lifted, the frigid air replaced by a sense of calm. The whispers ceased, and the house fell silent, a silence that felt peaceful rather than unsettling. Sarah stood before the mirror, her heart still pounding, but the fear had subsided, replaced by a profound sense of relief. She looked at her own reflection, no longer seeing the distorted images of her fears and traumas, but simply herself. The mirror, once a source of terror, now reflected only the moonlight streaming through the attic window, the connection to the past, the conduit. For the trapped spirits had been severed. The next morning the house felt different. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere had vanished, replaced by a sense of lightness and tranquility. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, but now they seemed to dance with joy rather than menace. Sarah went to the attic, drawn to the mirror one last time. She ran her hand along the intricately carved frame, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingertips. The glass was clear, reflecting only her own image. She saw a faint smile playing on her lips, a smile of peace and acceptance. Sarah decided to stay in the house. It was no longer a place of fear and torment, but a place of healing and new beginnings. She spent the next few weeks cleaning and restoring the house, bringing it back to its former glory. She even kept the mirror, placing it in the living room, where it became a beautiful antique rather than a source of terror. One evening, as Sarah sat in the living room, reading a book, she glanced at the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, clear and untroubled. For a moment, she thought she saw a faint image behind her, a fleeting glimpse of a woman and a child smiling. But when she looked again, only her own reflection remained. She smiled, knowing that Eleanor and Thomas had finally found peace, and that she, too, had found a sense of closure. The haunting of the mirror was over, replaced by a new dawn, a new beginning, a new reflection.